morning. You'd think that having been a professional athlete for 13 years, it would be a very good training having done that in terms of speaking in front of a large number of people. But for those of you who haven't been to a county cricket match, you should know that absolutely no one's there. So it's extremely disorientating to stand up and perform in front of a live audience. In fact, there are more attractive young people in this room than there were in all the grounds I played in my life added up together over 13 years. So the insight for today's talk, or the prompt for today's talk, is I spent my life around a lot of very confident people. Confident sportsmen, confident coaches, confident broadcasters, confident pundits, we've seen a lot of those recently during the election, confident historians, and of course very confident leader writers when I was leader writer for the Times. And at one level I've probably been perceived as being confident too. You need a measure of confidence to stand with a bat in your hand while someone's trying to hurl a ball at your head at 90 miles an hour. And you need a measure of confidence to tell someone who's bigger and stronger and much more famous than you that they're dropped or sacked from the team. And I think professional sport, perhaps more than any other sphere in the world, celebrates, hones, nurtures the concept of confidence as a good thing. But unfortunately, I was given a good memory, and I've been sort of keeping a track of actual performance in terms of judgment, decision-making, whether people are right or wrong. And I've come to the rather uncomfortable conclusion that confident people aren't right more often than most people. In actual fact, I would say confidence is very poorly or even inversely correlated with being right. So following that logic, and I'll start a little bit in my world of sport where I played captain and now I'm involved in decision-making as a coach in the IPL. Following my own logic, how can we make use of the fact that we're wrong very often, especially confident people, with a view to being a little bit wrong less often in the future? The first thing is, if we all actually tried to stay close to the things we've got wrong in the past, if we had a better memory, then we'd be less wrong in the future. And this is the kind of thing I'm not allowed to say in the dressing room, because people don't really read Milan Kundera, but there's a little adaptation. And the struggle of managers, you could say coaches or decision makers against powerlessness, is the struggle of memory against forgetting. It's very hard and painful, of course, to remember the process of being wrong. So there are some domains, obviously, where confidence is really useful. If you were a manager in a World Cup, as England usually go out on penalties, it happens every time, and your lead star penalty taker came up to you and said, "Boss, I just don't really feel confident about scoring the penalty," it's very hard to imagine a set of circumstances in which you'd go, "Great, really glad you told me that. That really makes me feel terrific." It's basically what he's telling you is, I'm going to miss, and he will miss. I can tell you from hard-earned personal experience of doing it wrong so many times, that in cricket, as a batsman, which as I was, you're often better off playing, quote, the wrong shot with total conviction, believing 100% in what you're doing, than you are in playing, quote, the right shot, the appropriate shot, what you should do, with a lack of conviction. So there are clearly some domains where confidence is very helpful. In actual fact, I would say the sportsman, what goes on in the process of playing sport is there's a transmutation of risk into certainty. Everything a sportsman does is actually based on probability. Nothing is certain. But the very best sportsmen, when they're out there and they're doing it, which is a crucial distinction, they are able to turn the concept of risk into a concept of certainty. They sort of know it's going to happen, even though, of course, often it doesn't. So that's maybe the reason why confidence is so valued in our sphere, in our world. But wait a second. Lots of things go on in sport which actually aren't like that. So I'll give you an example. I was standing on the pitch. I commentate for the BBC Test Match Special. We're out there at the toss. England, Australia, the Ashes. It's all on the line. The big moments come, the reckoning. Here we are. And I got chatting to one of the two teams' chairman and selectors. I'm not going to tell you which one. A couple of years ago. And I said, "How are you?" And then he was off. "I feel great. I'm so confident. The boys are feeling great. The team, what a team we've picked. We've picked a terrific team. We're so up for this. We are really ready. I just wish I was out there myself." And I'm sort of nodding along in the way I often have been in my life around sports when they're so confident, they're so seductive, it sweeps you along. What a wonderfully up for it, impressive, confident chap. Absolutely terrific. Great. Good luck for the game. I walked away, I thought, there's something not quite right about that conversation. I said, I remember, he's not playing. Basically, the chairman of selectors is involved in a cold, rational, dispassionate world. What are the best cards that I have in my hand to play in what order, and which cards should I leave to one side and discard? That's what a selector does. Now, once he's made that selection, it's like an investor buying a stock or a gambler placing his chips. There is nothing he can do. What he thinks about those decisions ceases to have any relevance whatsoever. So basically, he was clinging on to confidence in a completely inappropriate sphere. And that's something that I've come to see is basically a recurrent theme in my world. That people imagine they're all taking the penalty to win the World Cup, but lots of them are actually placing chips or deciding which card to play. They're involved in making judgments about probability, about exogenous events in which they are not the protagonist. They imagine they're the leading man in a drama when they're not the leading man. At best, they're potentially the casting director or the producer. So that made me think about areas in which confidence is relevant. Obviously, if you're an actor, if you're a front man, if you're a penalty taker, if you're a batsman, yes, whether you believe what you want to happen is going to happen is bound up with whether it does happen. But there are all those other spheres, and that's just four of hundreds of thousands, many of which are central to sport. Selection, recruitment, tactics, strategy, all those things have very little to do with confidence. So, enough theory, time to fess up. And I promise you don't need to know anything about cricket. Okay, you need to know one thing about cricket. There are basically three forms of cricket. Test cricket, very boring, played by old people and loved by old people. One-day cricket, which takes all day, a little bit in the middle. T20, very sexy, loved by young people. That's basically it. Kind of think of the T20 player as a cool barista, tattoos, earrings, all that kind of stuff. And Test cricket, represented by my colleague Jeff Boycott. Yorkshire, obdurate, always right. That kind of stuff. That's basically all you need to know. So, one of the things I do now is I'm team consultant for the Royal Challengers Bangalore in the IPL, the Indian Premier League, the glitziest, the biggest, blah, 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 2020 league. So I turned up there last year, and I'm one of my jobs is to bring some of these ideas into how we go about making long-term plans so we don't do what everyone else does, which is usually not very impressive. And I see this guy. Now, this guy batting in the nets. Now, I don't know if any of you know who he is. It's a difficult one, not a very good picture. It's called KL Rahul, young Indian star batsman. But at that point, almost no one had heard of him. And I'm watching him, and that's basically, the reason I've put that up is that is the most perfect, almost caricature of a test cricket shot. It's basically perfect, technically controlled, very subdued, could have been happening 200 years ago. Anyway, so I'm watching this guy, and he sets up, and that's his stance, and I think, okay, test batsman. Then someone walks past me and says, what do you think of KL Rahul? And I say, well, I'm just getting to see him for the first time. And this person says to me, who knows him very well, probably more of a test player than a T20 player. So he's just here, and we'll see how it goes, but this is probably not his leading format. So I kind of nod along and think, test player, that's the category I'm putting him. Then I have a chat with him afterwards. Hello, I'm Ed, I'm over here for a while, boom, boom, boom. Very polite, very articulate, and he talks about his hero, Rahul Dravid, who was like the most classical, old-fashioned, technically perfect test player of my generation. So basically, he stands in the correct old-fashioned way, he's polite, he's articulate, he's a test player. Right? That's enough, and I don't really think about him for the next 3 weeks. Who are we going to pick? I'm thinking about everyone else. Then there's an injury, and we pick this guy. What happens? 6 that way, 6 this way, 6 this way. He's the fastest scoring player in the league. Then he goes on to play for India, and he's currently sitting on, in all three forms, one days, T20s and tests, and he's smashing it everywhere. He's scoring faster than Virat Kohli, faster than Chris Gayle, faster than A.B. de Villiers. This guy is like the most rocket-hot player in the world. So me having that unfortunate memory, I'm thinking, how did I miss that? I'm watching him practice. What did I actually see? I went back to that first practice session in my head. If I hadn't been so busy talking and categorizing him and putting him in a classification which is entirely false and arbitrary, I'd have actually remembered he hit some really big sixes in the practice session. But I was too busy telling myself a story about players, slotting them into outmoded categories which no longer apply. So basically, in the busyness to tell myself a convincing story that made myself feel I knew and was able to make very quick judgments, I actually didn't take in what my eyes were really observing. Now, if I'd been listening a bit more carefully to Daniel Kahneman when I met up with him 5 years ago when thinking fast and slow, and Kahneman, of course, is kind of one of the founding figures of the discipline which slightly unites the themes of this conference, I guess. He probably would have called that the classification bias, or a connected idea of the representativeness bias. Now, it's Kahneman's ideas, and some of you who've read Michael Lewis's book, The Undoing Project, will know this, which are actually leading some of the more progressive thinkers in sport, particularly in the NBA. Basically, American sport's got more money, so they tend to tolerate better thinking somewhere in there, as long as, of course, more bad thinking too. But where there's money, there typically is more diversity. What the leading sort of behavioral scientists in the NBA called Daryl Morey, who's general manager of the Houston Rockets, and they're always asking themselves, in what way are we making assumptions which are actually stupid? In what way are we following conventional wisdom in ways which is damaging us in terms of optimizing our talent and getting the right people on the pitch, on the court? They tell this story about, they have various models for recruitment, and they had one player in 1 year who just lit up the model. It was like 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. Sign this guy. 7'1", these are his times, this is what he does, this is his track record coming from the lower leagues, sign him. But they're all sitting around the room and they all say, no, something about it we don't like, and they pass on him. When they reviewed that process, they figured out the only thing that made them walk away from signing the player was the fact that he was tall and wore glasses and was Asian. And they weren't used, if he'd been tall and black, there's loads of guys in the NBA like that are also brilliant athletes. They didn't believe the numbers that said that Jeremy Lin was a brilliant athlete because they weren't used to that classification already being out there in the league. So basically, where there's a model already there, and you can see how that type has already made a go of it, you're much more likely to say, he's one of those, let's go for him. But when someone's actually genuinely a new type, you tend to think there's something wrong and they don't believe the numbers. And that's exactly what I've experienced in making decisions about being wrong. It was actually Rory, when we spoke at the same event a few months ago, who told me, I think that the defining aim of most people within business is not to be good or to get things right, but it's to avoid being shouted at by the boss. Now, that's exactly the same inside sport. The thing I learned over 13 years is people like winning. Everyone likes winning. They'd rather win than lose. No one's going to disagree with that. And it's a much happier drive home on the team bus if you've won the game. But that's not the really big issue. The really big issue is we can't lose in a way that makes us look vulnerable, and we'll get criticized not just for losing, but for losing in a way that's considered stupid or inappropriate. Anyone can shrug off a defeat which is conventional. Well, that's just kind of like everyone would have made those decisions. That's fine. People can live with that. But actually living with the risk of losing and being different, that really frightens people. The problem is, of course, is that to innovate and to do new things, you have to live with the risk of being different and wrong in order to have the benefit of being different and right. So the real challenge inside sport, which puts such a high premium on confidence and such a high premium on conformity and convention, is to actually live with the prospect of loneliness. And the amazing thing about sport, which has so many coaches, and of course that's grown exponentially as sport has become richer, is how little coaches have done to actually offer any innovation. All the major innovations in sport actually came from players. So, no coach ever thought of that. You'd think that armies of professional track and field coaches, admittedly there weren't quite as many track and field coaches in the mid-60s when that happened, or late 60s, probably that photograph. You'd think that someone would have thought, you know what, trying to scissor my legs over a high jump, there's a better way. No one ever did. It was Dick Fosbury, there he is, I think that's 1968. He had to strike a deal with his coach, where he said, look, there's a better way of doing this, coach. And his coach said, look, you can practice this damn foolery, stupid way you've got, that's fine, but in competition you do it my way like everyone else. That was the deal he struck. just starts to win the argument before Mexico Olympics in 1968, and his coach finally relents and says, okay, just this once you can have a little go. Breaks the world record, wins gold. No one's ever really done anything in the high jump without following the Fosbury flop since then. Kevin Peterson, who I played with lots in cricket, very prepared to live on his own and to be a lonely character. Kevin, no coach ever had the idea that you're standing here with the bat like that, all the fielders are over there in a one-day game, because it's much more easy to hit powerfully like that, right? So no coach ever thought, you know what, why don't you just change your hands over and pretend you're left-handed for a second? No one ever thought of that. They were very busy taking the salary, nodding a lot in team meetings, saying, go on, let's be up for this, let's be confident, let's get out there, let's express ourselves. But no one actually sat back and said, where is it in the laws? We have laws in cricket, not rules, because everything comes back to the 18th century. Where is it that in the laws that says you're not allowed to change your hands over and hit the other way? Nowhere. So Kevin, being Kevin, just says, hang on a minute, all the fielders are over there. Hits it that way. Become a very central and sort of almost something you don't want to miss out on if you're a young player. Someone I know well, who I bumped into a couple of days ago in London, talked about what he's up to with his fitness training. Virat Kohli, the world's definitive cricketer at the moment, best player in the world, the only player ever to average 50 in tests, one-day internationals, and T20. No one's ever done that before. Virat, like a magician, high-skilled player, everyone's in awe of the things he can do, the touch, the finesse. He says, that's fine, it's not enough. I want to be the best in the world. I want to be the best there's ever been, maybe. He wouldn't say it like that, but he doesn't really take anyone seriously. He doesn't want to be the best in the world. And he doesn't want to stop there. He wants no limits. Just keep getting better, see what happens. Pretty good mindset. He has a conversation with a former track and field sprinter, Basu Shankar, and they come to the insight that everyone's doing the wrong things in their physical training. They're running, they're training to suffer, to tick a box. Well, I suffered hard, so no one can complain about my lack of effort or industry. And they're saying, hang on a minute, we're professional athletes, we're getting paid millions of dollars and pounds, rupees, trillions of rupees. We can do a bit better than this. How about we actually train to get way better at batting? So they go to a high-tempo powerlifting coming from track and field. No bulk added, just speed, sharpness, quickness. And of course, it's incredibly demanding. You have to sleep a lot, you have to eat brilliantly, you have to set your whole day up around the fact that you're going to be working really hard on your muscles and they need to recover. Virat starts doing it on the morning of every 2020 match. I was out there priming, muscle priming. So he goes to the gym, 20 minutes, kills himself, eat, recover, bang, off he goes, plays. First person ever to get 400s in that series in the IPL, became even more the best player in the world. So he basically was prepared to live with the fact that everyone was telling him, you're mad, don't lift weights, no one's ever done it. He was prepared to live with that loneliness. Pretty much everyone, except for Basu, his trainer, thought it was not a great idea. And now he's redefined how you can play. You can be the magician, and you can also be the strength and power guy. You can be sort of Wotan, and you can be Fasalt or Fafner. Niche joke for Wagnerians that also love T20. So the principle here, underlying all this stuff, is trying to identify when people are carrying on doing the wrong thing just because it's what everyone else does. And there's so much of that in sport, you'd be amazed. You'd think a highly competitive industry would be fully indulging mavericks and left field thinkers. You'd be quite wrong. The herd mentality is so strong, especially strong in a sphere that values cooperation and confidence. Everyone nodding, everyone slapping each other on the back, everyone saying how up for it they are. No one really saying, hang on a minute, why don't we cross our hands over and hit the ball where there's no fielders? Why don't we train like track and field guys and put everything together in a new way? And it reminded me a bit of one of the things I saw with my own sort of eyes and ears when I was a player about how wrong everyone had been about nutrition. In the 90s when I started, the fad was high carb, low fat. So everything was about carbo loading and all this stuff. Basically, it turns out that, as we now know, it isn't fat that makes you fat. Fat's basically got a PR problem. Very unfortunate that it's a food type and an outcome, and people therefore accidentally and wrongly made the transition from the food type to the body shape. Fat doesn't make you fat. We know that now. Sugar does. So it just had a PR problem. So it's also true that people thought that eating cholesterol led to having high cholesterol. I've got this. So basically, if you eat eggs, you get cholesterol in your heart. That's not true either, because basically, guess what? You wouldn't believe this. In the process of digestion, between an egg turning into that to actually being absorbed into your body, quite a lot of stuff goes on. So it doesn't just stay as the same thing. No scientists ever really considered that possibility. They just thought cholesterol from the outside goes to cholesterol in bad places inside your body. Not true. It was just like the fat and sugar mistake earlier on. Now, in the same way, and this is an analogy I'm kind of stretching, but I think it half works, that's a bit like confidence. There's a difference between confidence about the exterior world and confidence about the world in which you are a protagonist. If you're a performer, yes, of course, you're going to need a good measure of confidence. But if you're ultimately making decisions and judgments about exogenous events, and after all, most of us are, even though I have to perform in some contexts, I also have to make a lot of judgments, then confidence is actually far from being something you should be nurturing. It's something you should always be challenging. I was very interested by the end of Rory's speech when he talks about the longevity, the deep roots of behavioral science. Well, I actually think I'd question the word, how much of it actually is science. What I've seen in sport is a credulous rush towards sports science and the complete lack of attention to what I would call sports humanities. The idea that there is a value in wisdom, in logic, in rigorous critical thinking, not just saying someone out there has done a study on and then just saying let's all do that and rushing off. It's like sport is not actually a science. Like medicine, it's an evidence-based practice. And there's a huge amount of wisdom which has been lost by credulousness about following scientific fads. So if you're involved in exogenous events, if you're making decisions and judgments, let the losers be certain and console yourself instead with wins. Thanks very much. Am I allowed to be a rock now, Rory?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We've got time for, I think, a couple of questions. I was particularly fascinated. I think there's a wonderful Keynes quote that it is often better for the reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally.
Yes.
And that herd effect's very strong. There's one other thing I've always noticed, that, for example, it's much easier to be fired for being illogical than for being unimaginative.
Sure.
And so there's one of the strongest forces in business is if you pretend that economics is true. The product isn't selling, so we drop the price.
Yes.
Even if it fails, even if demand reduces at the lower price, you'll still keep your job.
Yeah.
If you do anything a bit weird...
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, as long as your tactics are understood by everyone and you kind of all, quote, buy into them, and you can get them across to the guy that's going to be the pundit at 10:30 on Match of the Day, it's fine if you lose. But if you do stuff that people can't figure out, even though it might be way ahead of the curve, you're in trouble. And that's why, incidentally, in terms of buying people, particularly buying coaches, you should always be looking for distressed assets. Basically, you should be looking for people who were ahead of their time, got sacked before their ideas came good. They're the ones who will be undervalued by the market.
Is this true? By the way, in basketball, players would shoot better free throws if they did it underarm.
Well, that's a Gladwell idea, where it's certainly true that bad free throwers keep going with a method when they might actually be better doing that. And yes, there's an argument that sometimes doing things in an incredibly basic and sort of amateurish way might be better. But again, there's that sense of, I don't want to look stupid. So there are certain... There was actually a big moment in a World Cup semi-final where Mark Waugh needed to effect a run-out, and he just got down and rolled the ball on the ground, and the wicketkeeper, the bells, and they won. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, because everyone else would have been sort of panicking it, and it would have gone overthrow. So yeah, there are times when doing something quite naff is actually very cool.
So I think the very interesting thing that when footballers take penalties, they'd be better off more often kicking straight down the middle, rather than either side. The problem is that you're more likely to score kicking down the middle, but you look much stupider if you fail.
Yes, it's true, although it's also true that with penalty taking, it's an open rather than a closed skill. So when these people write articles saying, if everyone did this, they'd score more, no, they wouldn't, because the goalkeepers would wise up. So in actual fact, the best thing to do is to be unpredictable, which is why the really cool thing to do would be look at the second hand on the clock and say, I'm just going to randomize this turn round, the second hand's going that way, I'm aiming for that corner. Because Frank Lampard told me that the worst thing about penalty taking is if you change your mind because of what the goalie does on his last track record, because you're getting knocked off. If you can randomize your strategy, it can't be defended against.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank God I don't care about being cool. Thank you so much, Ed Smith.